The desert wind howled through Copper Ridge that scorching July morning in 1878, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and something darker, the metallic tang of fear that seemed to cling to every adobe wall and wooden post in the territorial town. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the shadow of the red rock formations that gave the settlement its name, a young woman named Rosalind Harper pressed her face against the cool glass of her bedroom window, watching the dust devils dance across the barren landscape like ghosts of the Apache warriors who once called this land home. She couldn't have known that by sunset her entire world would be shattered by the crack of a judge's gavel and the cold steel of a deputy's gun. She couldn't have imagined that the very people she'd trusted with her life would become the architects of her destruction, and she certainly never dreamed that salvation would come riding out of the canyon on horseback, painted for war, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a heart that beat with the ancient rhythm of the desert itself. This is the story of how love conquered law, how courage defeated corruption, and how sometimes the most unlikely hero appears when darkness seems to have won. It's a tale of the Old West that they don't teach in history books, because some truths are too powerful for textbooks and too dangerous for those who profit from keeping them buried. The Harper Ranch sat like a jewel in the harsh embrace of the Arizona Territory, its adobe walls glowing golden in the perpetual sun that baked the desert floor. Rosalind had grown up within those walls, raised by her father Theodore Harper after her mother's death, when she was barely old enough to remember the sound of a woman's laughter echoing through their home. Theodore was a good man, weathered by the unforgiving land, but softened by love for his daughter. He'd built their ranch from nothing, carved prosperity from the copper-rich earth, and created a sanctuary where Rosalind could bloom like the rare desert roses that somehow found life in the most impossible places. At 23, Rosalind possessed the kind of beauty that made men stumble over their words and women lower their eyes in envy. Her hair caught fire in the sunlight, cascading in waves of auburn that seemed to hold the warmth of the desert sunset. Her eyes were the deep green of the few oases that dotted the territory, and her skin had been kissed by the sun into a golden hue that spoke of days spent riding the range with her father, learning the business that would one day be hers. But it wasn't just her beauty that made her remarkable. It was the fierce intelligence that blazed behind those emerald eyes, the quick wit that could match any man's banter, and the compassionate heart that had earned her the love of every ranch hand and townsfolk who knew her. The copper mine that Theodore had discovered 3 years earlier had transformed their modest ranch into one of the most valuable properties in the territory. The Harper Copper Works employed half the men in Copper Ridge, and the wealth it generated had allowed Theodore to build his daughter a life of comfort and security. He'd sent her to finishing school in San Francisco, where she'd learned to speak French and play piano, to dance the waltz and discuss literature with the daughters of railroad barons and cattle kings. But Rosalind had always been happiest here, in the vast emptiness of the desert, where the sky stretched endlessly and a person could breathe without the weight of society's expectations pressing down upon them. She'd had suitors, of course, young men from good families who traveled from as far as Denver and Santa Fe, drawn by stories of the beautiful Harper heiress. But none had captured her heart. None had understood that beneath the refined exterior beat the heart of a woman who could ride like the wind, shoot straighter than most men, and who dreamed of adventures beyond the drawing rooms and tea parties that seemed to define a lady's proper existence. Theodore had never pressed her to marry, content to let her choose her own path, secure in the knowledge that the ranch would be hers, regardless of whether she took a husband. It was this very independence, this refusal to be controlled or claimed, that had first drawn the attention of Judge Cornelius Blackwood. He was a man accustomed to having whatever he desired, and what he desired most was power. Power over the law, power over the people, and power over the land itself. He'd arrived in Copper Ridge 2 years earlier, appointed by the territorial governor to bring order to a region that had been plagued by Apache raids and mining disputes. But Judge Blackwood's idea of order was tyranny disguised as justice, and his court had become a place where verdicts were bought and sold like cattle at auction. The judge was an imposing figure, tall and lean, with silver hair that he wore slicked back and cold grey eyes that seemed to see right through to a person's soul and find it wanting. He dressed in expensive suits shipped from the East, carried himself with the arrogance of a man who'd never been told no, and wielded his judicial power like a weapon against anyone who dared to oppose him. The townspeople feared him, the local officials deferred to him, and the few brave souls who'd tried to stand up to him had found themselves facing trumped-up charges and sentences that sent them to territorial prison or worse. For months, Judge Blackwood had been pressuring Theodore Harper to sell the copper mine. The offers had started reasonable, then grown more insistent, accompanied by veiled threats about the dangers of operating a mine in such lawless territory. When Theodore continued to refuse, citing his intention to leave the business to his daughter, the judge's mask of civility had begun to slip. He'd made it clear that he didn't believe women should own property, that Rosalind would be much better off with a husband to guide her decisions, and that he'd be more than happy to provide that guidance himself. The very suggestion had made Theodore's blood run cold. He'd seen what happened to the young women who'd attracted the judge's attention. They tended to disappear from town suddenly, usually with stories about moving back east to live with relatives, though the fear in their eyes before they left told a different tale. He'd forbidden Rosalind from going into town unaccompanied and had hired additional security for the ranch, but he'd underestimated the reach of Blackwood's corruption and the lengths to which the judge would go to get what he wanted. The trap had been set with diabolical precision. A carefully forged document had appeared in the territorial records, claiming that Theodore Harper had defaulted on a massive loan from a bank in Phoenix. The paperwork was perfect, the signatures flawless, and the debt so enormous that the only way to satisfy it was to surrender the ranch and the mine to Judge Blackwood, who had conveniently purchased the loan from the bank at a fraction of its value. When Theodore had protested, producing his own financial records to prove his solvency, he'd found himself facing charges of fraud and document tampering. The trial had been a mockery of justice, held in Judge Blackwood's own courthouse with a jury composed entirely of men who owed their livelihoods to the judge's patronage. Theodore's lawyer, a young idealist named William Chen, who'd recently arrived from San Francisco, had fought valiantly, but had been outmaneuvered at every turn. Evidence had been ruled inadmissible, witnesses had been intimidated into silence, and the verdict had been a foregone conclusion from the moment the judge's gavel had called the court to order. Theodore Harper had been sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison, his property seized to satisfy the fabricated debt, and his daughter left alone and defenseless in a world that had suddenly turned hostile. But Judge Blackwood wasn't finished with his revenge. He'd waited exactly 1 week after Theodore's sentencing before making his final move, appearing at the ranch with Deputy Marshal Grimm and a proposal that was really an ultimatum disguised as an offer of salvation. The morning sun was already climbing toward its merciless zenith when Rosalind heard the sound of horses approaching the ranch house. She'd been in the garden, tending to the roses that her mother had planted so many years ago, finding some small comfort in the familiar ritual of caring for something beautiful in a world that had suddenly turned ugly. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up, shading her eyes against the glare, and what she saw made her blood turn to ice in her veins. Judge Blackwood sat his horse like a conqueror surveying his domain, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. and his cold eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Beside him rode Deputy Marshal Grimm, a mountain of a man with hands like ham hocks and a reputation for violence that made even the toughest cowboys give him a wide berth. Behind them came 6 more men, all wearing the badges of territorial law enforcement, all armed with rifles and revolvers, all looking like they'd been chosen more for their willingness to follow orders than their commitment to justice. "Miss Harper," Judge Blackwood called out, his voice carrying across the yard with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I trust you're well this fine morning." Rosalind set down her watering can and walked toward the house, her mind racing as she tried to understand what this visit could mean. She'd heard nothing from her father since his sentencing, and every attempt to visit him in prison had been denied. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ranch hands had been dismissed the day after the trial, paid off and sent away by the judge's men, leaving her alone with only the elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, for company. "Judge Blackwood," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady, despite the fear that was beginning to claw at her chest. "I'm afraid I wasn't expecting visitors." The judge dismounted with practiced ease, his boots hitting the ground with a sound like gunshots in the morning stillness. "I'm sure you weren't, my dear, but circumstances have forced my hand, and I'm afraid we have urgent business to discuss." He walked toward her with the confidence of a man who'd already won whatever game he was playing, and Rosalind found herself backing toward the house, every instinct screaming that she was in terrible danger. The deputy marshal and his men remained, mounted, but their hands rested on their weapons, and their eyes never left her face. "What business could we possibly have to discuss?" she asked, reaching the steps of the front porch and turning to face him with the solid wall of the house. At her back, Judge Blackwood smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression, only the cold satisfaction of a predator who'd cornered its prey. "Why? The matter of your father's debt, of course, and the question of how you intend to repay it." "My father owes no debt," Rosalind said firmly. "The documents you presented were forgeries, and everyone in this territory knows it. You've stolen our property and imprisoned an innocent man, but you'll get nothing more from the Harper family." The judge's smile widened, and he began to climb the steps toward her, forcing her to retreat further. "My dear child, I'm afraid you misunderstand the situation entirely. Your father was convicted of fraud by a jury of his peers, and his debt to me is a matter of legal record. The question now is whether you intend to honor that debt or face the consequences of defaulting on it." "What consequences?" Rosalind demanded, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to know the answer. "Well," Judge Blackwood said, reaching the porch and standing far too close to her, "I've been investigating your father's financial dealings, and I've discovered some rather disturbing irregularities. It appears that you've been complicit in his fraudulent activities, helping him hide assets and deceive creditors. The evidence is quite compelling, and I'm afraid a jury would have no choice but to find you guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud." Rosalind's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the full scope of the trap that had been laid for her. "You're lying. I've done nothing wrong, and you know it." "Perhaps," the judge conceded with a shrug, "but as I'm sure you're aware, perception is often more important than reality in matters of law. A beautiful young woman, left alone and desperate, driven to crime by her father's bad example. It's a compelling narrative, don't you think? One that would certainly result in a lengthy prison sentence." The threat hung in the air between them like a rattlesnake coiled to strike, and Rosalind felt the walls of her world closing in around her. She'd seen what happened to young women in territorial prisons, and she knew that few emerged with their sanity intact, let alone their lives. "However," Judge Blackwood continued, his voice dropping to an almost intimate whisper. "I'm a reasonable man, and I believe in mercy. I'm prepared to offer you an alternative to prosecution, a way to settle your father's debt and secure your own future at the same time." "What alternative?" she asked, though every fibre of her being already knew the answer and recoiled from it. "Marriage," he said simply. "Become my wife, and I'll consider the debt satisfied. Refuse, and you'll face the same fate as your father, though I suspect the prison experience will be considerably harder on you than it has been on him." The words hit her like physical blows, and for a moment Rosalind couldn't breathe. She'd known this was coming, had suspected it from the moment she'd seen the judge's eyes on her in the courtroom, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that terrified her. She thought of her father, locked away in a cell, and wondered if he was even still alive. She thought of her mother, who died so young and had never had to face such impossible choices. And she thought of herself, trapped between two unthinkable fates with no way out. "I need time to consider," she said finally, hating the way her voice shook but unable to steady it. Judge Blackwood's expression hardened. "I'm afraid time is a luxury you don't possess, my dear. You see, I've taken the liberty of arranging for the ceremony to take place this very afternoon. Reverend Mills is waiting at St. Mary's Chapel, and I've already procured a marriage license from the territorial clerk. All that remains is for you to say yes. And if I say no, then Deputy Marshal Grimm will place you under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, and you'll spend tonight in a cell instead of in my home. The choice, as they say, is yours." Rosalind looked at the Deputy Marshal, who sat his horse like a statue, his face expressionless, but his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. She looked at the other men, all of them watching her with the cold interest of predators waiting for the kill, and she looked at Judge Blackwood, who was no longer even pretending to be anything other than what he was, a man who took what he wanted and destroyed anyone who stood in his way. "I'll need to change into something more appropriate," she said quietly, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "Of course," the judge said, his smile returning as he sensed victory. "Take all the time you need. We'll wait right here." Rosalind walked into the house on unsteady legs, her mind reeling from the enormity of what was happening. In the space of a few minutes, her entire life had been torn away from her, and she was being forced to choose between two forms of imprisonment. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom, where Mrs. Winters was waiting with tears streaming down her weathered face. "Oh, child," the older woman whispered, gathering Rosalind into her arms. "I heard every word. What are we going to do?" "There's nothing we can do," Rosalind replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "He has all the power, and I have none. If I refuse, I'll rot in prison, and he'll find another way to get what he wants anyway." "There has to be something," Mrs. Winters insisted. "Some way to fight back." Rosalind pulled away from the embrace and walked to her wardrobe, where her finest dresses hung like the remnants of a life that was already over. She selected a simple blue dress, the one she'd worn to church socials and town celebrations, and began to change into it with mechanical precision. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "but not today. Today I survive. Tomorrow maybe I'll find a way to live." She pinned her hair up in a style that her mother had favored, applied a touch of rouge to her pale cheeks, and slipped on the pearl earrings that had been her mother's wedding gift from her father. Looking at herself in the mirror, she saw a woman dressed for her own funeral, and the sight made her stomach lurch with nausea. "Miss Rosalind," Mrs. Winters said urgently, "there's something you should know. Something I heard in town yesterday." Rosalind turned from the mirror, surprised by the urgency in the older woman's voice. "What is it?" "There's been talk about the Apache. Chief Standing Bear's band has been seen in the canyons, closer to town than they've been in months. Some Folks say they're planning raids, but others—" She paused as if afraid to voice her thoughts. "Others what?" "Others say they're watching, waiting for something. There's been strange signs, smoke signals from the mesas, riders seen at night. The cavalry has been asking questions, but the Apache always seem to know they're coming." Rosalind felt a strange flutter in her chest, though she couldn't have said why. "What does that have to do with me?" "Maybe nothing," Mrs. Winters admitted, "but your father always said the Apache were the most honorable people he'd ever met. He traded with them fair and square, never cheated them or looked down on them. Like most white folks do. Maybe they remember that." Before Rosalind could ask what she meant, Judge Blackwood's voice boomed from the yard below. "Miss Harper, I'm afraid my patience is wearing thin. The ceremony is scheduled for 2 o'clock, and we mustn't keep the Reverend waiting." Rosalind took one last look around the room where she'd grown up, where she'd dreamed of love and adventure and a future that was now being stolen from her. Then she walked downstairs and out into the blazing afternoon sun, where her wedding dress felt like a shroud, and her future husband waited with the cold smile of a man who'd already won. The ride to St. Mary's Chapel felt like a funeral procession through the gates of hell. Rosalind sat rigid in the back of Judge Blackwood's ornate carriage, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling, while the desert landscape rolled past in a blur of red rock and thorny mesquite. The judge sat across from her, his grey eyes studying her face with the satisfaction of a collector who just acquired a rare specimen for his cabinet. Deputy Marshal Grimm rode alongside the carriage, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to follow them like a dark omen. The chapel sat on the edge of town, a modest adobe structure with a wooden cross that caught the afternoon light like a beacon of false hope. Rosalind had attended services there with her father, had sat in those simple wooden pews and listened to Reverend Mills speak of God's mercy and the triumph of good over evil. Now, as the carriage rolled to a stop in front of the building, those words seemed like cruel jokes told by a universe that had forgotten how to distinguish between justice and mockery. "Beautiful day for a wedding, don't you think?" Judge Blackwood remarked as he stepped down from the carriage and turned to offer Rosalind his hand. She stared at that hand for a long moment, knowing that taking it would be the first step in surrendering whatever remained of her freedom. But with Deputy Marshal Grimm's cold eyes upon her and 6 armed men surrounding the carriage, she had no choice but to place her fingers in his and allow him to help her down. The chapel doors stood open, revealing the flickering glow of candles that someone had lit for the occasion. Reverend Mills waited in the doorway, his usually kind face pale and drawn with an expression that suggested he was as trapped in this charade as she was. Behind him, Rosalind could see a handful of townspeople who'd been gathered as witnesses, the bank clerk, the telegraph operator, the owner of the general store, all of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else, but had been given no choice in the matter. "Reverend Mills," Judge Blackwood called out cheerfully as they approached the chapel, "I trust everything is prepared for the ceremony." The elderly minister nodded reluctantly, his eyes meeting Rosalind's for just a moment before looking away. "In shame. Everything is ready, Judge, though I must say this seems rather sudden. Perhaps the young lady would prefer to wait, to have her father present." "Her father is indisposed," the judge cut him off sharply. "And Miss Harper is eager to begin her new life. Aren't you, my dear?" Rosalind felt the weight of all those eyes upon her, felt the heavy presence of the armed men who flanked the chapel entrance, and knew that any word of protest would only make her situation worse. "Yes," she said quietly, the lie burning her, throat like acid. "I'm ready." As they stepped into the chapel's dim interior, Rosalind caught sight of something that made her heart skip a beat. There, carved into one of the wooden support beams near the altar, was a symbol she recognized, a small eagle with outstretched wings, the mark that Apache traders used to identify safe places and trusted friends. Her father had shown her that symbol years ago, had explained that it meant protection and honor among the Apache people. Seeing it now, in this place where her freedom was about to be stolen, felt like a message from some benevolent spirit that hadn't abandoned her entirely. The ceremony began with Reverend Mills reading from his worn Bible in a voice that shook with barely controlled emotion. Judge Blackwood stood beside Rosalind at the altar, his hand resting possessively on her arm, while Deputy Marshal Grimm loomed in the front pew like a mountain of menace. The words of the marriage service echoed through the chapel like a death knell, each phrase driving home the reality of what was happening to her. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Mills began, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Judge Cornelius Blackwood and Miss Rosalind Harper in holy matrimony. Marriage is a sacred institution ordained by God and blessed by His grace." Rosalind barely heard the words. Her mind had retreated to a place deep inside herself, a fortress of memory and hope where the judge's cold presence couldn't reach her. She thought of her father, wondering if he was still alive in that terrible prison, if he knew what was happening to her. She thought of her mother, who died too young to see her daughter grow into womanhood, and wondered what advice she might have given for surviving such impossible circumstances. "If anyone knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage," Reverend Mills continued, his voice growing stronger as if he hoped someone might actually object, "let them speak now or forever, hold their peace." The chapel fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through the open doors and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Rosalind closed her eyes and made a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening, begging for deliverance that she knew would never come. Judge Blackwood's grip on her arm tightened slightly, a reminder that he was savoring every moment of her humiliation. And then, just as Reverend Mills opened his mouth to continue with the ceremony, the sound of thundering hoofbeats filled the air outside the chapel. The noise grew louder and closer, accompanied by war cries that made the blood freeze in the veins of every person present. Through the open doors came the unmistakable sight of Apache warriors on horseback, their faces painted for battle, their weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun. The townspeople in the chapel gasped and scrambled for cover as the riders circled the building, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that swirled through the doorway like a desert sandstorm. Deputy Marshal Grimm reached for his gun, but froze when he saw the number of warriors surrounding them, at least 20 mounted Apache, all armed and clearly prepared for war. At the head of the war party rode a figure that made Rosalind's heart stop beating for one impossible moment. He was tall and powerfully built, his copper skin marked with black and white war paint that emphasized the fierce intelligence in his dark eyes. His long black hair was adorned with eagle feathers, and across his bare chest were scars that spoke of battles fought and won. He carried a rifle in one hand and a war lance in the other, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man born to lead. "This ceremony will not continue," he announced in perfect English, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd before settling on Judge Blackwood with unmistakable hostility. "The woman belongs to herself, not to any man who would take her by force." Judge Blackwood's face flushed red with rage and embarrassment. "How dare you interrupt a legal proceeding? This is a Christian wedding, and you have no authority here." The Apache warrior dismounted with fluid grace and walked toward the altar, his weapons still in hand but held in a way that suggested controlled readiness rather than immediate threat. Behind him, his warriors remained mounted but alert, their eyes scanning the chapel for any sign of resistance. "My name is Running Wolf," the warrior said, his voice calm despite the tension that filled the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. "I am war chief of the Chiricahua Apache, and I have come because this woman's father was a friend to my people. Theodore Harper traded with us fairly, treated us with respect when other white men saw us as animals to be hunted. Now I hear that his daughter is being forced into marriage against her will, and this cannot be allowed to stand." "You're mistaken," Judge Blackwood blustered, though Rosalind could see the fear beginning to creep into his eyes. "Miss Harper has consented to this marriage freely, haven't you, my dear?" All eyes turned to Rosalind, and she felt the weight of the moment pressing down upon her like a physical force. She looked at Judge Blackwood's cold, calculating face, then at Deputy Marshal Grimm's hulking form, then at the terrified townspeople who'd been forced to witness this travesty. Finally, her gaze settled on Running Wolf, and what she saw there gave her the courage she needed to speak the truth. "No," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I have not consented. I'm being forced into this marriage under threat of imprisonment on false charges. This man has stolen my father's land, had him convicted on fabricated evidence, and is now trying to steal me as well." A murmur of shock rippled through the chapel as the townspeople heard her words. Many had suspected the truth about Theodore, Harper's conviction, but none had dared to speak against Judge Blackwood's version of events. Now, hearing Rosalind's confession, their expressions shifted from fear to shame, and then to something that might have been the beginning of courage. Running Wolf nodded grimly. "Then you will come with us. No woman should be forced to marry against her will, whether she is Apache or white." "She'll do no such thing," Judge Blackwood snarled, his mask of civility finally slipping completely. "Grimm, arrest these savages for disrupting the peace." Deputy Marshal Grimm reached for his gun, but before he could clear leather, Running Wolf's rifle was pointed directly at his chest. Around the chapel, the other Apache warriors raised their own weapons, and suddenly the balance of power had shifted dramatically. "I would not recommend that course of action," Running Wolf said quietly. "My warriors are excellent marksmen, and your men are outnumbered. Surrender your weapons, and no one needs to die today." For a long moment, the chapel hung suspended, in a tableau of violence barely held in check. Then, one by one, Judge Blackwood's men began to lay down their guns, recognizing the futility of resistance. Deputy Marshal Grimm was the last to comply, his face twisted with rage as he slowly placed his revolver on the nearest pew. "You're making a terrible mistake," Judge Blackwood hissed at Running Wolf. "I am a federal judge, appointed by the territorial governor. Interfering with my duties is an act of war against the United States government." Running Wolf's expression didn't change. "Your government has been at war with my people for decades, Judge. One more battle will make little difference. But this is not about war. This is about justice, something you seem to have forgotten." He turned to Rosalind, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle despite the fierce paint that decorated his face. "Will you come with us willingly? I cannot promise you safety forever, but I can promise you will not be forced into any marriage while you are under my protection." Rosalind looked around the chapel one more time, at the life she was about to leave behind forever. She thought of her comfortable home, her beautiful dresses, the social standing she'd enjoyed as the Harper heiress. All of that was already gone, stolen by the man who stood beside her with murder in his eyes. What Running Wolf offered wasn't a return to her old life. It was a chance at something entirely different, unknown and dangerous but free. "Yes," she said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "I'll come with you." She stepped away from Judge Blackwood and walked toward Running Wolf, feeling lighter with each step. Behind her, she could hear the judge's furious curses and threats, but they seemed to come from very far away, as if she was already leaving that world behind. Running Wolf extended his hand to her, and she took it without hesitation. His skin was warm and calloused from years of handling weapons and horses, and his grip was firm but gentle. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "My father taught me." He nodded and led her outside, where one of his warriors held the reins of a beautiful pinto mare. "This is Swift Cloud," Running Wolf said, helping her mount the horse. "She is gentle but fast, and she will carry you safely." As Rosalind settled into the saddle, she felt a strange sense of rightness, as if this was exactly where she was meant to be. The desert wind whipped through her hair, pulling it free from its careful arrangement, and the sun beat down on her face with an intensity that made her feel vibrantly alive for the first time in days. Running Wolf mounted his own horse, a magnificent black stallion that pranced with barely contained energy. Around them, his warriors formed a protective circle, their weapons still ready, but their expressions less hostile, now that their mission had been accomplished without bloodshed. "Wait," Judge Blackwood's voice rang out from the chapel doorway. "You can't just take her. She's my lawful wife." Running Wolf turned in his saddle to face the judge, his dark eyes blazing with contempt. "She spoke the truth before your own God and these witnesses. The ceremony was not completed, and she refused her consent. By any law that matters, she is free." "I'll have the cavalry after you," Blackwood screamed. "I'll see you all hanged for this." "The cavalry is welcome to try," Running Wolf replied calmly, "but they will find us difficult to catch in our own desert." With that, he raised his lance high in the air and let out a war cry that echoed off the canyon walls. His warriors responded with their own fierce shouts, and together they wheeled their horses and rode out of Copper Ridge like a whirlwind of dust and determination. Rosalind clung to her horse's mane as they galloped across the desert, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Behind her, her old life receded into the distance, becoming nothing more than a cluster of buildings shimmering in the heat. Ahead lay the vast emptiness of the Apache homeland, dangerous and unknown, but offering something she'd never had before, the chance to choose her own destiny. As they rode deeper into the desert, Running Wolf pulled his horse alongside, hers. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the thunder of hoofbeats. Rosalind considered the question honestly. She was riding into the wilderness with a band of Apache warriors, leaving behind everything she'd ever known to face an uncertain future among people she'd been taught to fear. By any reasonable measure, she should be terrified. "No," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I'm not afraid. For the first time in days, I'm not afraid." Running Wolf smiled then, the fierce war paint unable to hide the warmth that lit his eyes. "Good," he said. "Fear makes people do foolish things. Courage, even when it trembles, is much more useful." They rode on through the afternoon heat, following trails that only the Apache knew, winding through canyons and across mesas that seemed to stretch forever under the pitiless blue sky. Rosalind's body ached from the unaccustomed pace, and her fine dress was soon torn and dusty, but she felt more alive than she had since her father's arrest. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Running Wolf raised his hand to signal a halt. They had reached a hidden valley nestled between towering red cliffs, where a spring bubbled up from the earth to create a small oasis of green in the midst of the barren landscape. "We will rest here for the night," Running Wolf announced, dismounting and helping Rosalind down from her horse. "Tomorrow we will reach my village, where you will be safe." As his warriors made camp with the efficient movements of men accustomed to life in the wilderness, Running Wolf led Rosalind to the spring, where she knelt and drank deeply of the cool, clear water. The simple act of quenching her thirst felt like a luxury after the suffocating atmosphere of the chapel and the dusty ride across the desert. "Why did you help me?" she asked, as they sat beside the spring, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "You could have been killed back there, and your warriors with you." Running Wolf was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames of the small fire that one of his men had built. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and hard-won wisdom. "My sister was taken by white soldiers 3 summers ago," he said. "She was forced to marry a cavalry officer, told that if she refused, our entire band would be hunted down and killed. She chose to sacrifice herself to save our people." His jaw tightened with suppressed anger. "She died 2 moons later, far from her home and family, among strangers who saw her as nothing more than a prize to be won." Rosalind felt tears sting her eyes as she understood the deeper meaning behind his actions. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Her name was Singing Dove," Running Wolf continued. "She had a laugh like water over stones and could track a deer through the deepest forest. When she died, part of our people's spirit died with her." He turned to look at Rosalind, and in his eyes she saw not just grief, but a fierce determination. "When I heard that another woman was being forced into marriage against her will, I knew I could not let it happen again. Perhaps I cannot bring my sister back, but I can prevent her fate from befalling another." They sat in comfortable silence after that, listening to the soft murmur of conversation from the warriors around the fire and the distant cry of coyotes in the hills. Rosalind found herself studying Running Wolf's profile in the firelight, noting the strong line of his jaw and the intelligence that shone in his dark eyes. The war paint had been washed away at the spring, revealing a face that was both fierce and gentle, marked by sun and wind and the weight of leadership. "What will happen to me now?" she asked finally. "I can't stay with your people forever." Why not?" Running Wolf asked, turning to face her. "You have no home to return to, no family to claim you. Judge Blackwood will never stop hunting you if you remain in the white world. Here among the Apache, you can be free to choose your own path." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Rosalind had been raised to believe that civilization meant towns and churches and proper behavior, that the wilderness was a place of danger and savagery. But sitting here under the vast canopy of stars, surrounded by men who had risked their lives to save her from a fate worse than death, she was beginning to understand that civilization and savagery might not be what she'd been taught to believe. "I don't know anything about Apache ways," she said. "I don't speak your language or understand your customs. I would be a burden to your people." "You would learn," Running Wolf said simply. "My grandmother came to our band as a captive from another tribe. She knew nothing of our ways either, but she became one of our most respected elders. Strength and wisdom matter more than birth among the Apache." As if to prove his point, one of the younger warriors approached their fire carrying a bowl of stew and a blanket. He offered both to Rosalind with a shy smile, speaking a few words in Apache that she didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear from his tone. Welcome, comfort, acceptance. "Thank you," she said, accepting the gifts gratefully. The stew was simple but delicious, flavored with wild herbs and chunks of tender meat, and the blanket was woven from soft wool in patterns that seemed to tell stories of their own. "Little Fox says you have kind eyes," Running Wolf translated, nodding toward the young warrior. "He says anyone who shows such courage in the face of fear must have a strong spirit." Rosalind felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire or the food. These men, who barely knew her, were already treating her with more respect and kindness than Judge Blackwood had shown in all their encounters. The contrast was stark and telling. As the night deepened and the warriors settled into their bedrolls, around the dying fire, Running Wolf showed Rosalind to a sheltered spot among the rocks where she could sleep safely. He spread his own blanket on the ground nearby, close enough to protect her, but far enough away to respect her privacy. "Sleep well," he said softly. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges, but tonight you are safe." Rosalind wrapped herself in the gifted blanket and lay down on the hard ground, expecting to toss and turn with worry about her uncertain future. Instead, she found herself drifting towards sleep with surprising ease. The desert night was alive with sounds, the rustle of small animals in the brush, the distant howl of wolves, the soft breathing of sleeping warriors. But none of them frightened her. For the first time since her father's arrest, she felt truly safe. Just before sleep claimed her completely, she heard Running Wolf's voice speaking quietly in Apache to one of the sentries he'd posted. Though she couldn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakable, careful, protective, determined. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, she knew she wouldn't face them alone. Dawn broke over the hidden valley like a whispered promise, painting the red cliffs in shades of rose and gold that took Rosalind's breath away. She woke to the sound of water trickling over stones and the soft murmur of Apache voices discussing the day's journey. Her body ached from sleeping on the hard ground, and her once fine dress was now a tattered reminder of the life she'd left behind, but her spirit felt lighter than it had in weeks. Running Wolf was already awake, crouched by the spring with his long black hair loose around his shoulders, washing the last traces of war paint from his face. In the morning light, without the fierce markings that had transformed him into a warrior of legend, he looked younger and somehow more human. The sharp planes of his face were softened by the golden sunrise, and when he turned to see her stirring, his smile was warm and genuine. "The desert shows you her most beautiful face at dawn," he said, rising and walking toward her with the fluid grace that seemed natural to all Apache. "My grandmother used to say that anyone who could appreciate such beauty had the eyes to see truth in all things." Rosalind pushed herself up from her makeshift bed, wincing as muscles protested the unfamiliar sleeping arrangements. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was the wisest person I ever knew," Running Wolf replied, his voice carrying a note of deep affection. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said that true strength showed itself not in how fiercely someone could fight, but in how gracefully they could adapt to change." As the camp stirred to life around them, Rosalind watched the Apache warriors go about their morning routines with practiced efficiency. They moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years spent living close to the earth, wasting nothing, taking only what they needed. It was a stark contrast to the excess and waste she'd grown accustomed to in her privileged life, yet there was something deeply appealing about their simple competence. Little Fox, the young warrior who'd brought her food the night before, approached with a shy smile and a bundle of clothing. He spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward Rosalind's torn dress with obvious concern. "He says his sister made these." "For trade," Running Wolf translated. "He thinks they will fit you better than your white woman's dress for the journey ahead." Rosalind examined the bundle and found beautifully crafted Apache clothing, a soft deerskin skirt decorated with intricate beadwork, a matching blouse that would allow for much greater freedom of movement, and sturdy moccasins that looked far more practical than her delicate leather shoes. The workmanship was exquisite, every stitch placed with care and artistry. "Please tell him I'm honored by his generosity," she said, holding the clothing against herself to check the fit. "These are beautiful." Little Fox beamed with pride when Running Wolf conveyed her words, and he launched into another rapid explanation that made several of the other warriors chuckle. "He says his sister will be pleased to know that her work will be worn by the brave white woman who chose freedom over gold," Running Wolf explained, his own smile widening. "Word of your escape has already spread among our people. You are becoming something of a legend." The idea of being a legend was both flattering and terrifying. Rosalind had never thought of herself as particularly brave. Yesterday's escape had felt more like survival than heroism. But as she retreated behind a screen of rocks to change into the Apache clothing, she found herself standing a little straighter, moving with more confidence. Perhaps courage wasn't about feeling fearless, but about acting despite fear. The Apache garments fit her perfectly, and when she emerged from behind the rocks, she felt transformed. The soft deerskin moved with her body instead of constraining it, and the moccasins allowed her to feel the earth beneath her feet in a way that her fashionable boots never had. She caught Running Wolf watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Approval, certainly, but something deeper as well. "You look," he began, then stopped, seeming to search for the right words in English. "You look like you belong here." The simple statement sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. For most of her life, she'd felt like she was playing a role, the dutiful daughter, the proper lady, the wealthy heiress. But standing here in the desert dawn, dressed in Apache clothing and surrounded by warriors who'd risked their lives to save her, she felt more authentically herself than she ever had before. They broke camp with the same efficiency they'd shown in setting it up, leaving no trace of their presence except for the carefully banked ashes of their fire. Running Wolf helped Rosalind mount Swift Cloud, his hands lingering just a moment longer than necessary as he checked her stirrups and adjusted her reins. "The journey to our village will take most of the day," he said, swinging easily onto his own horse. "The path is difficult, but it will keep us hidden from any cavalry patrols Blackwood might send after us." As they rode out of the hidden valley, Rosalind found herself looking back one last time at the peaceful oasis where she'd spent her first night of freedom. It already felt like a sacred place, the spot where her old life had truly ended and her new one had begun. Then they were climbing up through a narrow canyon, following a trail that seemed to exist more in Running Wolf's memory than on the actual ground. The landscape they traveled through was unlike anything Rosalind had ever seen. Towering mesas rose from the desert floor like ancient castles, their red sandstone walls carved into fantastic shapes by wind and water. Hidden springs created tiny pockets of green in the vastness, and everywhere she looked, life persisted in forms adapted to the harsh environment. Twisted juniper trees, blooming cacti, lizards that seemed to dance across the hot rocks. As they rode, Running Wolf began to teach her the Apache names for the things they saw. "Gauche," he said, pointing to a soaring hawk. "Itza," indicating an eagle perched on a distant cliff. "Biko," he explained, as they passed a stand of oak trees growing in an unlikely green canyon. Rosalind repeated each word carefully, enjoying the musical quality of the Apache language and the way it seemed to capture something essential about each creature or plant. The words felt different in her mouth than English, more connected to the natural world, less concerned with possession than with relationship. "Your language is beautiful," she said, as they paused to water their horses at a hidden spring. "It sounds like it grew from the desert itself." Running Wolf looked pleased by her observation. "Apache is not just words," he explained. "Each word carries the wisdom of our ancestors, the knowledge of how to live in harmony with the earth. When you speak Apache, you speak the thoughts of people who have survived in this desert for 1,000 generations." They were joined at the spring by an older warrior who'd been scouting ahead. He spoke urgently to Running Wolf in rapid Apache, his weathered face creased with concern. As Rosalind listened to the exchange, she caught a few words she recognized. Soldiers, and many, and something that might have been following. "What is it?" she asked when the conversation ended. Running Wolf's expression had grown serious. "Crow Feather says there is a cavalry patrol moving through the desert about half a day behind us. 40 soldiers, well-armed and moving fast. It seems Judge Blackwood has convinced the army that we've committed an act of war." The news sent a chill down Rosalind's spine. She'd known that her escape would have consequences, but the idea of 40 armed soldiers pursuing them made the danger suddenly very real. Will they find us? Not if we reach the village before they do, Running Wolf said confidently, but we must move quickly and carefully. The desert can hide us, but only if we respect her secrets. They rode harder after that, following paths that seemed to exist only in the minds of the Apache warriors. Sometimes they traveled along dry creek beds, the horses' hooves muffled by sand. Other times they picked their way across bare rock that would leave no tracks. Always they stayed hidden from the open desert, using every fold in the land to mask their passage. As the sun climbed higher and the heat became oppressive, Rosalind began to understand why the Apache had been able to survive in this harsh landscape while other tribes had been driven from their lands. They moved through the desert like water flowing downhill, finding the path of least resistance while never losing sight of their destination. Every rock formation, every plant, every shift in the wind carried information that they read as easily as she might read a book. During a brief rest in the shade of an overhanging cliff, Running Wolf noticed her studying the way his warriors scanned the horizon and read the tracks left by animals. "You are learning to see," he observed. "That is good. In the white world, people often look without seeing, hear without listening. The desert teaches patience and attention." "How long did it take you to learn all this?" Rosalind asked, gesturing toward the seemingly empty landscape that she was beginning to realize was full of information she couldn't yet decipher. "I have been learning since I could walk," Running Wolf replied. "But the learning never ends. Every season brings new lessons. Every storm teaches new survival skills. My grandfather used to say that the desert is the greatest teacher in the world, but also the most demanding. She will share her secrets with those who approach her with respect, but she shows no mercy to the arrogant or careless." As if to emphasize his point, one of the warriors suddenly raised his hand for silence. In the distance, almost too faint to hear, came the sound of horses moving at speed. The cavalry patrol was closer than they'd thought. Running Wolf made quick hand signals to his men, and they immediately began covering their tracks, using brushes of sage to sweep away hoofprints, and carefully arranging stones to hide any sign of their passage. Within minutes, it was as if they'd never been there at all. They traveled in absolute silence after that, communicating only through hand gestures and following routes that seemed impossible for horses to navigate. Rosalind found herself amazed by Swift Cloud's sure-footedness as the mare picked her way along ledges barely wider than her hooves and scrambled up rocky slopes that looked impassable. The pursuit continued through the heat of midday. A deadly game of hide-and-seek played out across the vast desert landscape. Twice they heard bugle calls echoing from distant canyons as the cavalry spread out to search for them. Once they had to hide for nearly an hour in a cave, while soldiers passed so close that Rosalind could hear their horses snorting and their equipment jangling. It was during that tense hour in the cave that she truly began to understand what her escape had cost. The soldiers hunting them weren't just following orders. They were angry, frustrated men who'd been made to look foolish by a band of Apache warriors. If they were caught, there would be no trial, no questions asked. Running Wolf and his men would be shot as renegades, and she would be returned to Judge Blackwood to face whatever punishment he'd devised for her defiance. As they finally emerged from the cave and continued their flight, Rosalind found herself riding closer to Running Wolf, drawing comfort from his calm presence. Despite the danger they faced, he seemed completely unafraid, moving through the desert with the confidence of a man who was truly at home in this harsh landscape. "Are you frightened?" he asked quietly as they navigated a particularly treacherous stretch of broken rock. Rosalind considered the question honestly. "Yes," she admitted, "but not of dying. I'm frightened of being taken back, of losing this chance at freedom. Yesterday I thought my life was over. Now I feel like it's just beginning." Running Wolf studied her face with those dark, intelligent eyes. "You understand, then, why we fight. Freedom is worth any risk, any hardship. A life without choice is not really living at all. The words resonated deep in her soul. For the first time, she truly understood why the Apache had resisted for so long, why they continued to fight against impossible odds rather than submit to reservation life. The desert was harsh and unforgiving, but it was theirs. They were free to live according to their own customs, to follow their own beliefs, to make their own choices about how to face each day. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the landscape around them gradually changed. The open desert gave way to a maze of canyons and mesas that seemed to fold in on themselves like a vast stone labyrinth. The walls rose higher and higher around them until they were traveling through corridors of red rock that barely admitted the sky. "We are close now," Running Wolf said, the first words anyone had spoken in hours. "This is the secret heart of our homeland, where the cavalry horses cannot follow and their maps become useless." Indeed, the path they followed seemed to exist more as an idea than a physical reality. They squeezed through gaps between towering walls, scrambled up natural staircases of fallen stone, and traversed ledges that offered spectacular views of the desert, stretching endlessly in all directions. It was a journey through a hidden world, a place where time seemed to move differently, and the concerns of civilization felt very far away. Finally, as the sun was painting the canyon walls in shades of deep orange and purple, they rounded a bend in the trail and emerged into a hidden valley that took Rosalind's breath away. It was larger than the oasis where they'd spent the night, a natural amphitheater surrounded by towering cliffs and filled with the green of trees and grass. A clear stream ran through the center of the valley, and scattered along its banks were the traditional Apache dwellings called wickiups, dome-shaped structures made of bent poles covered with brush and hides. People emerged from the wickiups as the war party approached, and Rosalind was surprised by the diversity she saw. There were elderly men and women with faces lined by decades of desert sun, warriors in their prime with the confident bearing of fighters, young mothers carrying children, and adolescents who watched the newcomers with curious eyes. All of them looked at her with interest, but without hostility, accepting her presence with the same calm grace that seemed to characterize everything about Apache culture. A particularly elderly woman approached their group, her silver hair braided with colored ribbons and her weathered face creased by a lifetime of smiles. She spoke to Running Wolf in rapid Apache, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "This is my grandmother, Wise Dove," Running Wolf said, dismounting and helping Rosalind down from her horse. "She is the grandmother of our band, keeper of our traditions, and judge of character. She wants to meet the white woman who chose honor over comfort." Wise Dove stepped closer to Rosalind, studying her face with eyes that seemed to see right through to her soul. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the old woman simply looked, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she smiled and spoke a few words in Apache. "She says you have the eyes of someone who has seen darkness, but has not let it steal her light," Running Wolf translated. "She says you are welcome in our home for as long as you wish to stay." The formal acceptance by the band's matriarch seemed to release the tension that had gripped the gathered Apache. Children began to giggle and point at Rosalind's unusual appearance, while adults stepped forward to greet the returning warriors and hear news of their mission. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the cold fear that had dominated her life in Copper Ridge. As the sun set behind the canyon walls and cook fires began to bloom throughout the village, Rosalind found herself surrounded by curious but gentle Apache women who seemed determined to make her feel at home. They brought her food, a hearty stew very different from anything she'd eaten before, but delicious in its simplicity, and fresh water for washing. They examined her Apache clothing with approval and made small adjustments to improve the fit. Through it all, Running Wolf remained nearby, translating when necessary, but mostly just watching as she began to find her place in this new world. There was something in his expression that she was beginning to recognize, not just protection or duty, but a growing personal interest that made her heart beat faster whenever their eyes met. "Tomorrow, we will begin teaching you our ways," he said as the evening wound down and the village settled into the peaceful rhythm of desert night. "If you are to live among us, you must learn not just our language, but our customs, our relationship with the land, our understanding of what it means to be truly free." Rosalind nodded, feeling both excited and daunted by the prospect. "I'm ready to learn," she said. "I want to understand this world you've brought me into." "Good," Running Wolf replied, his smile visible even in the firelight. "But remember, learning Apache ways is not just about changing what you do. It is about changing how you see yourself, how you understand your place in the great web of life. Are you prepared for such a transformation?" Looking around at the peaceful village, at the faces of people who'd accepted her without question, despite their recent hardships, at the vast, star-filled sky that seemed to promise infinite possibilities, Rosalind felt a certainty that surprised her with its strength. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think I've been waiting my whole life to become who I'm meant to be." The weeks that followed blurred together like watercolors bleeding into one canvas, each day bringing new revelations about what it meant to truly live rather than merely exist. Rosalind woke each morning to the sound of the stream flowing through the village and the soft voices of Apache women preparing for the day's work. The rigid schedules and social obligations that had once defined her life seemed like memories from another world, replaced by a rhythm that followed the natural cycles of sun and season rather than the artificial demands of civilization. Wise. Dove had taken personal responsibility for Rosalind's education, and the elderly woman proved to be both a patient teacher and an exacting taskmaster. Each dawn found them walking together through the village and the surrounding countryside, with Wise Dove pointing out medicinal plants, explaining the seasonal migrations of animals, and sharing stories that carried lessons about Apache values and beliefs. The white world teaches that humans are separate from nature, that you must conquer the earth to survive, Wise Dove said one morning as they gathered roots for medicine. Her English was heavily accented but clear, learned through decades of interaction with traders and soldiers. Apache way is different. We are part of the web of life, no more important than the eagle or the coyote, but no less either. When you understand this, you understand how to live in harmony instead of constant war. The lesson was reinforced in countless small ways throughout each day. Food was never wasted, with every part of a plant or animal used for something useful. Water was treated as the precious gift it was in the desert, conserved and shared with careful attention. Even clothing and tools were crafted to last for generations, made with a reverence for the materials and the skill required to transform them into useful objects. Rosalind found herself learning skills she'd never imagined needing. Morning Star, a woman near her own age who'd become her closest friend among the Apache, taught her to weave baskets from willow shoots and pine needles, creating patterns that told stories about the history of their people. Grey Wolf's wife, Singing Rain, showed her how to prepare and preserve different types of food, from drying meat into jerky that would last through the winter to grinding corn into meal that could be made into nutritious cakes. But it was Running Wolf who became her most important teacher, showing her not just the practical skills needed to survive in the desert, but the deeper understanding that separated mere survival from truly flourishing. He taught her to read the subtle signs that revealed the presence of water in seemingly barren landscapes, to identify the tracks of different animals and understand their behavior patterns, to navigate by the stars when darkness made travel necessary. More importantly, he began to share with her the spiritual beliefs that gave meaning to Apache life. They would sit together in the evenings after the day's work was done, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in brilliant colors, while he explained the complex relationships between all living things that form the foundation of Apache philosophy. "Your people see time as a straight line," he said one evening as they sat on a high ledge overlooking the village. "Past, present, future, all separate from each other. Apache understanding is different. All time exists together, ancestors and descendants united in the eternal now. When I make a decision, I consider how it will affect 7 generations of my people who have not yet been born." The concept was initially difficult for Rosalind to grasp, raised as she'd been in a culture that emphasized individual achievement and immediate results. But gradually, as she observed the way Apache decisions were made with careful consideration for long-term consequences, she began to understand the wisdom in such thinking. Every choice rippled outward through time, affecting not just the immediate situation, but the entire future of the community. This long-term perspective was evident in how the Apache approached conflict with the outside world. Rather than seeking immediate revenge for past wrongs, they focused on protecting their people and preserving their way of life for future generations. Even Running Wolf's rescue of her had been motivated not by desire for confrontation, but by commitment to principles that transcended personal convenience. As the days passed into weeks, Rosalind found herself changing in ways that went far deeper than simply learning new skills. The constant anxiety that had plagued her in Copper Ridge, the sense of being trapped in a life that never quite fit, gradually faded away. In its place grew a confidence she'd never known before, rooted not in social position or material possessions, but in genuine competence and community acceptance. The physical changes were equally dramatic. Her hands, once soft from a life of privilege, became calloused from working with tools and materials. Her skin darkened further from daily exposure to the desert sun, and her body grew stronger from the constant physical activity required by Apache life. She learned to move with the fluid grace that characterized all the Apache women, economical in motion, but capable of sustained effort when necessary. But it was the internal transformation that mattered most. For the first time in her life, she felt truly useful, contributing to something larger than herself in ways that had real meaning. When she helped gather food for the winter stores, she knew that her efforts would help keep children fed during the harsh months ahead. When she learned to make medicine from desert plants, she gained the ability to ease suffering and potentially save lives. Running Wolf watched these changes with growing interest that went beyond his role as her protector and teacher. She began to notice the way his eyes followed her as she moved through the village, the slight smile that played around his lips when she mastered a particularly difficult skill, the protective way he positioned himself when other men showed interest in the beautiful white woman who'd come to live among them. The attraction was far from one-sided. As Rosalind learned more about Running Wolf's character and history, she found herself drawn to him in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude for her rescue. He was a man of deep principles who'd never compromised his integrity despite facing constant pressure to abandon his people's traditional ways. His leadership was based not on dominance, but on wisdom and genuine concern for those under his protection. He possessed a quiet strength that needed no boasting, a courage that showed itself not in reckless violence, but in the willingness to face any hardship for the sake of what he believed to be right. Their growing closeness didn't go unnoticed by the other members of the band. Wise Dove, in particular, seemed to take a special interest in observing their interactions, her ancient eyes twinkling with what might have been matchmaking satisfaction. whenever she caught them sitting together or working side by side. Running Wolf has not looked at a woman with such interest since his wife died in the Great Sickness 3 summers ago. Morning Star confided to Rosalind one afternoon as they worked together preparing hides for winter clothing. His heart has been like a closed flower since then, but you seem to make it bloom again. The information both thrilled and sobered Rosalind. She'd noticed that Running Wolf wore no wife, but hadn't known about his loss or understood the depth of grief he'd carried. The knowledge made his growing interest in her seem even more significant and also more fragile. She didn't want to be simply a replacement for what he'd lost, but something entirely new and different. The opportunity to explore these feelings came during the autumn gathering season, when the entire band spread out across their territory to collect the nuts, seeds, and other plant foods that would sustain them through winter. Rosalind found herself assigned to work with a small group that included Running Wolf, traveling to distant canyons where certain valuable plants grew in abundance. They established a temporary camp in a hidden valley even more remote than their main village, a place where ancient petroglyphs decorated the canyon walls and natural pools reflected the desert sky like mirrors. For 3 days, they worked from dawn to dusk, gathering and processing food while enjoying the easy camaraderie that came from shared labor toward a common goal. It was on the 3rd evening, as they sat around their small fire watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky, that Running Wolf finally spoke about his past. Her name was Gentle Breeze, he said quietly, his voice carrying across the still air. We were married when we were both very young, before the soldiers came and everything changed. She died trying to help others when the fever swept through our people. I held her hand as she left this world and entered the spirit realm. Rosalind listened without interrupting, understanding that this was a gift of trust that shouldn't be treated lightly. In the firelight, she could see the pain that still lived in his eyes when he spoke of his wife, but also something else, a healing that had begun without him fully realizing it. For 3 years, I believed my heart had died with her, he continued. I focused only on leading our people, on fighting the battles that needed to be fought, on surviving each day as it came. But then, he paused, turning to look directly at her, then I met a white woman with green eyes who chose freedom over safety, who faced the unknown rather than accept a life without choice, and I began to remember what it felt like to hope for something beyond mere survival. The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Rosalind felt her heart racing as she recognized the moment that would define whatever relationship might grow between them. She could retreat into safety, maintain the comfortable distance of teacher and student, protector and protected, or she could step forward into something that might transform them both. I never expected to find love in the desert, she said, softly, surprised by her own boldness. I thought my heart was broken, beyond repair by everything I'd lost. But you've shown me that breaking open can be the beginning of something beautiful rather than the end of everything good. Running Wolf moved closer to her across the small space that separated them, his movements careful and deliberate. When he reached out to touch her face, his fingers were gentle despite their calloused strength, tracing the line of her cheek as if memorizing every detail. You are nothing like her, he said, and somehow that felt like the highest compliment he could offer. Gentle Breeze was like a quiet stream, peaceful and constant. You are like the lightning that dances across the summer sky, fierce and bright and impossible to predict. Both are beautiful, but in completely different ways. When he kissed her, it was with a reverence that spoke of second chances and new beginnings. Unlike the forced intimacy that Judge Blackwood had tried to impose, this felt like a choice, freely made by two people who'd found something precious in each other. The desert night wrapped around them like a blessing, And for the first time since her mother's death, Rosalind felt truly at home in the world. They didn't speak of marriage that night, or make promises about a future that remained uncertain in a world where Apache and white societies existed in constant conflict. But they acknowledged the bond that had grown between them, the deep connection that transcended the circumstances of their meeting and spoke to something fundamental about who they were as individuals. The next morning brought news that shattered their peaceful interlude. Grey Wolf arrived at their camp before dawn, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with urgency. The conversation he had with Running Wolf was rapid and intense, conducted in Apache too fast for Rosalind to follow, but she caught enough words to understand that something terrible had happened. "What is it?" she asked when the exchange ended, and Grey Wolf had ridden away to spread the news to other gathering parties. Running Wolf's expression was darker than she'd ever seen it. "Judge Blackwood has convinced the territorial governor to declare our entire band to be renegades in violation of treaty obligations. They've issued orders for our arrest or elimination, and a force of 200 soldiers is moving into our territory to enforce those orders." The words hit her like physical blows. "Because of me, because you rescued me." "No," Running Wolf said firmly, grasping her hands in his. "This was always coming. Blackwood and men like him have been looking for an excuse to drive us from our traditional lands since the day copper was discovered in these mountains. Your rescue simply gave them the pretext they needed to act. But if I went back, if I surrendered to them, you would die, and we would still be hunted," Running Wolf interrupted. "The time for compromise has passed. Now we must choose between fighting for our freedom or accepting destruction on their terms." As they broke camp and prepared for the rapid journey back to their village, Rosalind wrestled with the terrible knowledge that her quest for freedom had brought danger to people who'd shown her nothing but kindness. The Apache way of thinking about consequences across generations suddenly took on personal urgency, as she realized that her choices might affect not just her own future, but the survival of an entire community. The ride back to the village was accomplished in grim silence, following routes that avoided the main trails where soldiers might already be moving. When they finally arrived at the hidden valley, they found the community in controlled chaos. As families prepared for what might be a long period of running and hiding, food was being packed into portable bundles, weapons were being checked and cleaned, and the elderly and children were being prepared for the hardships that lay ahead. Wise Dove approached Rosalind as she dismounted from Swift Cloud, the elderly woman's face serious but not accusing. "The time of testing has come," she said in her careful English. "Now we will see what you are truly made of, White Daughter. Will you run when the path becomes dangerous, or will you stand with the people who have claimed you as family?" The question was fair, and Rosalind understood that her answer would determine not just her own future, but her place in Apache history. She could ask Running Wolf to help her escape to Mexico or California, could try to build a new life somewhere, far from the consequences of her choices. Or she could embrace the path she'd started down and accept whatever hardships came with it. "I will stand," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the busy village. "These people are my family now. Their fate is my fate." Wise Dove studied her face for a long moment, then nodded with satisfaction. "Good, then we will face whatever comes together, as Apache do. And perhaps, when the storm passes, there will be a new story to tell around our fires, the story of the white woman who chose to be Apache when it mattered most." As the village prepared for war, Rosalind found herself working alongside women who'd become her sisters, preparing supplies and equipment for the battles ahead. The life of privilege and comfort she'd once known seemed like something from a dream, replaced by the hard reality of survival in a world that had suddenly become very dangerous. But as she worked, she felt a peace she'd never known before. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be, fighting for something that mattered alongside people she loved. Whatever came next, she would face it not as Rosalind Harper, the sheltered heiress, but as someone new, a woman who'd been forged by fire and tested by hardship, who'd chosen love over safety and freedom over comfort. The desert wind that night carried the sound of distant drums, Apache signals calling scattered bands together for the fight that was coming. As Rosalind listened to that ancient rhythm, she understood that she was about to become part of a story much larger than herself, a tale of courage and resistance that would echo through the generations of Apache yet unborn. The war drums echoed through the hidden valley for 3 days, calling scattered Apache bands from across the territory to gather for what everyone knew might be their final stand. Warriors arrived in small groups, their faces painted for battle, their weapons sharp and ready. With them came stories of burned villages, captured families, and soldiers who showed no mercy to anyone who resisted their advance. Rosalind watched the preparations with a mixture of awe and terror. These weren't the savage raiders that newspapers portrayed, but families preparing to defend their children, their way of life, their very existence against forces that vastly outnumbered them. She saw mothers teaching their daughters to hide food and water in secret caches, fathers showing their sons how to move silently through the desert, and elders sharing ancient prayers that called upon the spirits of warriors long dead to guide the living through the darkness ahead. Running Wolf had been transformed by the approaching conflict. The gentle teacher who'd shown her how to read the desert signs was now revealed as a war chief whose reputation commanded respect from every Apache band in the territory. Men twice. His age sought his counsel, and when he spoke in the council meetings that lasted deep into each night, even the most experienced warriors listened with careful attention. "We cannot win this war with weapons alone," he told the assembled chiefs on the 3rd night of gathering. "They have more soldiers, more guns, more supplies, but we have something they lack. We know this land as they never will, and we fight not for conquest, but for survival." The strategy that emerged from those councils was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than meeting the army in open battle, where superior numbers would decide the outcome, the Apache would use the desert itself as their greatest weapon. They would strike swiftly and disappear like smoke, forcing the soldiers to chase shadows while the harsh environment took its toll on men unaccustomed to desert warfare. But first, they needed to buy time for the non-combatants to reach safety in the most remote canyons, places where even the Apache rarely ventured and where an army could never follow. This meant someone had to delay the advancing column to draw their attention and slow their progress, while the vulnerable members of the tribe disappeared into the trackless waste. It was during the final war council that Rosalind made the decision that would define the rest of her life. As the chiefs debated tactics and timing, she stood and addressed the gathering in the careful Apache she'd learned during her months with the band. "I am the reason the soldiers come," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the council circle. "Judge Blackwood wants me returned to face his justice, and he will not stop hunting all of you until he gets what he wants." But what if there was another way? The council fell silent as every eye turned toward her. Running Wolf's expression was unreadable, but she could see the tension in his shoulders as he realized what she was about to propose. "Let me go to them," she continued. "Let me walk into their camp and offer to surrender. While they are distracted by their prize, your warriors can strike at their supplies, their horses, their communications. I can be the bait that draws them into a trap." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Half the council erupted in protest, while the other half argued for the tactical advantages of her plan. Running Wolf said nothing, but his silence was more eloquent than any words could have been. "It is too dangerous," declared Bearkiller, an elderly war chief whose scars testified to decades of fighting. "You are family now. We do not sacrifice family to save ourselves." "But I'm not truly family," Rosalind replied, the words painful to speak but necessary to voice. "I am Apache in my heart, but white in my skin. That difference can be used as a weapon against our enemies." Wise Dove, who had remained silent throughout the heated debate, finally spoke. "Tell us, daughter, what you truly think will happen when you surrender to these soldiers." Rosalind met the old woman's knowing gaze steadily. "I think Judge Blackwood will want to make an example of me. He'll want a public trial, a spectacle that shows what happens to those who defy his authority. That means keeping me alive long enough to get me back to Copper Ridge. And then I die," Rosalind said simply, "but I die as Apache, and my death serves the survival of my people." The words hung in the air like smoke from a sacred fire, heavy with finality and sacrifice. Around the circle, weathered faces reflected the struggle between tactical necessity and human emotion. These were people who understood the reality of war, who knew that sometimes victory required terrible choices. Running Wolf finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "There is another way. I know Judge Blackwood's mind. He is a man driven by pride and the need to control. If we can wound that pride deeply enough, if we can show him publicly that his authority means nothing in the desert, we might break his will to continue this pursuit." "What do you propose?" asked Bearkiller. "We take the war to him," Running Wolf said, standing and beginning to pace as his thoughts took shape. "We strike at Copper Ridge itself, not to destroy the town, but to humiliate the man who thinks himself master of this territory. We show everyone that Judge Blackwood cannot even protect himself in his own domain." The plan that emerged from the remainder of that council was breathtaking in its audacity. While the main Apache force continued to harass the advancing army and lead them deeper into the desert, a small strike force would circle around through hidden paths to attack Copper Ridge. Their target wouldn't be the innocent townspeople, but the symbols of Blackwood's power: his courthouse, his jail, his grand house where he held court like a feudal lord. But the true genius of the plan lay in its final element. They would time their attack to coincide with the town's annual harvest festival, when Blackwood would be hosting territorial officials and wealthy merchants in a grand celebration of his authority. The humiliation of being driven from his own party by the savages he'd promised to eliminate would destroy his credibility and likely end his political career. Rosalind insisted on being part of the strike force, despite Running Wolf's strong objections. "You need someone who knows the town's layout," she argued. "Someone who can get you past the guards and into position without being detected. I'm the only one who's been inside Blackwood's house." "You're also the person he wants most to capture," Running Wolf countered. "If you're seen, if you're taken, then I'll face the same fate I was willing to face as bait for the army," she interrupted. "But this way, I have a chance to strike back at the man who destroyed my family." The debate continued for hours, but eventually necessity won over emotion. Rosalind's knowledge of Copper Ridge was indeed crucial to the success of the mission, and her personal motivation made her perhaps the most committed member of the strike force. They departed the hidden valley before dawn on a morning when the desert air was crisp with the promise of approaching winter. The strike force consisted of 12 warriors, including Running Wolf and several of his most trusted fighters. They carried minimal supplies and the finest horses in the Apache herds, animals bred for speed and endurance in the harsh desert environment. The journey to Copper Ridge took them through some of the most spectacular and dangerous country in the territory. They traveled by night when possible, following ancient trails that few white men had ever seen. During the day, they rested in hidden canyons and natural shelters, always alert for signs of the cavalry patrols that were searching for Apache bands throughout the region. As they drew closer to their destination, the landscape began to change. The wild beauty of the deep desert gave way to areas marked by human activity, mining claims, ranch boundaries, wagon roads that connected the scattered outposts of white civilization. For Rosalind, it was like traveling backward through time to a world she'd once inhabited, but which now seemed foreign and artificial. On the final night before their attack, they made camp in the same hidden valley where Running Wolf had first brought her after her rescue, sitting by the same spring where she'd drunk deeply of freedom for the first time. Rosalind felt the weight of how much her life had changed in the months since that desperate flight from the chapel. "Are you ready for this?" Running Wolf asked as they sat together under the stars, their voices low to avoid carrying to the other warriors scattered around the small oasis. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," she replied, surprising herself with the truth of it. "For months I felt like I was running from my past instead of running toward my future. Tomorrow I finally get to face what was done to me and my father. And afterward, when this is finished, what then?" It was a question they'd both been avoiding, the uncertainty that lay beyond whatever happened in Copper Ridge. Even if their mission succeeded, even if they humiliated Judge Blackwood and broke his power, there would still be other officials, other soldiers, other men who saw the Apache as obstacles to be removed rather than people with legitimate claims to their ancestral lands. "Afterward, we build whatever life we can build," Rosalind said. "Maybe we'll have to keep running, keep fighting. Maybe we'll find a place where we can live in peace. But whatever comes, we'll face it together." Running Wolf took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "When this is over, I want to marry you properly, according to Apache custom. I want you to be my wife, not just in heart, but in the eyes of our people." The proposal was simple, without grand romantic gestures or flowery speeches, but it carried a sincerity that took her breath away. "Yes," she said, the word barely a whisper in the desert night. "Yes, I want that, too." They didn't make love that night, both understanding that the mission ahead required clear heads and focused attention. But they held each other as they slept, drawing strength from their closeness and the promise of a future that seemed suddenly possible despite all the obstacles arrayed against them. The Harvest Festival was in full swing when they reached the outskirts of Copper Ridge the following evening. The sound of music and laughter drifted across the desert air, mingling strangely with the distant howling of coyotes and the whisper of wind through the sage. Lanterns had been strung between the buildings, and the main street was crowded with people in their finest clothes, celebrating the bounty of another successful year. From their hiding place in the rocks above the town, Rosalind could see Judge Blackwood's house blazing with light. Carriages filled the yard, and well-dressed figures moved back and forth across the windows, like actors on a stage. The scene was exactly as Running Wolf had predicted, a grand display of power and prosperity designed to impress the territorial officials whose support Blackwood needed to maintain his position. "Remember," Running Wolf said as they made final preparations for the assault, "we strike hard and fast, but we harm no innocents. Our target is Blackwood and the symbols of his authority, nothing more." The warriors blackened their faces with charcoal and checked their weapons one final time. Rosalind had traded her Apache dress for dark clothing that would help her blend into the shadows, and she carried a rifle that Running Wolf had taught her to use during their weeks of preparation. They moved into the town like ghosts, splitting into 3 groups that approached different targets simultaneously. Rosalind went with Running Wolf's group toward the judge's house, while the other warriors struck at the courthouse and the jail, where her father had been held before his transfer to the territorial prison. The assault began with the courthouse, where a tremendous explosion shattered the night quiet as the Apache destroyed the records and symbols of territorial authority that had been used to legitimize so much theft and oppression. The sound brought people running from the festival, creating exactly the confusion that the strike force needed to reach their other objectives. At Judge Blackwood's house, the attack was more personal and devastating. They swept through the grand rooms where territorial officials had been dining and drinking, sending the terrified guests fleeing into the night in their evening clothes. Rosalind found herself face to face with Judge Blackwood himself in his study, the same room where he'd no doubt planned her forced marriage and her father's imprisonment. The judge's face went white with shock and rage when he saw her. "You!" he snarled, reaching for a pistol in his desk drawer. "I should have known you'd come crawling back like the savage you've become." "I came back to deliver a message," Rosalind said calmly, her rifle trained on his chest. "From the Apache people you've tried to destroy, and from every person whose life you've ruined with your corruption. You're nothing but a whore who ran off with savages," Blackwood spat, his hand still inching toward his weapon. "When I'm done with you—" His words were cut off by the thunder of Running Wolf's rifle as the war chief appeared in the doorway behind Rosalind. The judge's pistol flew from his hand, shattered by the precise shot, and he cowered back against his desk like the coward he'd always been beneath his facade of authority. "Judge Cornelius Blackwood," Running Wolf said in a voice that carried absolute authority, "by the laws of the Apache people, I find you guilty of theft, murder, and the oppression of innocents. Your sentence is exile from this territory. If you are found here after sunrise tomorrow, your life is forfeit." "You can't do this!" Blackwood screamed, his voice breaking with panic. "I'm a federal judge. You have no authority over me." "Sir, your authority ends here," Rosalind said, stepping closer to the terrified man. "Just as it ended the moment you tried to force me into marriage. Just as it ended when you imprisoned my father on false charges. Your reign of terror is over." As if to emphasize her words, the sound of more explosions echoed through the town as the other Apache groups completed their missions. The jail was burning, along with the records that had been used to justify so many injustices. The courthouse bell tower collapsed with a crash that could be heard for miles. "This is what happens when tyrants forget that their power exists only by the consent of the governed," Running Wolf told the judge. "You have lost that consent, and now you face the consequences." They left Blackwood cowering in his ruined study and made their way back through the chaos-filled town to their rendezvous point. The mission had been a complete success. They'd struck at the heart of territorial authority and demonstrated that even in his own stronghold, Judge Blackwood was powerless against people fighting for their freedom. The ride back to Apache territory was triumphant but subdued. They'd won a significant victory, but everyone understood that it was only one battle in a war that might continue for generations. Still, as they put distance between themselves and Copper Ridge, Rosalind felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she'd carried since her father's arrest. When they finally reached the hidden valley where the Apache bands had gathered, they were greeted with celebration that lasted through the night. The destruction of Blackwood's power base had sent shockwaves through the territorial government, and reports were already coming in of other corrupt officials fleeing their posts rather than face similar retribution. It was 3 days later, as the various Apache bands prepared to disperse to their winter camps, that Running Wolf and Rosalind were married according to traditional Apache custom. The ceremony was simple but profound, conducted by Wise Dove under the open sky, with the entire community as witnesses. In the old days, when the world was young, the spirits gave the Apache a great gift, Wise Dove intoned as she performed the ancient ritual. They said that two people who truly saw each other, who chose to walk the same path despite all obstacles, would become stronger together than either could ever be alone. As Running Wolf and Rosalind exchanged vows in both Apache and English, promising to support each other through whatever trials lay ahead, the desert wind carried their words across the vast landscape that had become their home. They were no longer the sheltered heiress and the Apache war chief who'd rescued her, but something entirely new, partners in a love that had been forged by shared struggle and tested by fire. The years that followed brought many challenges. The territorial government eventually sent new officials to replace Judge Blackwood, who disappeared into obscurity and was never seen in Arizona again. The Apache continued to fight for their freedom and their traditional lands, sometimes through warfare and sometimes through negotiation, but always with the unbreakable spirit that had sustained them for countless generations. Through it all, Rosalind and Running Wolf built a life together that honored both their cultures while creating something uniquely their own. They had children who grew up speaking both Apache and English, who learned to read the desert signs and also to read books, who understood that strength came not from conquest, but from the courage to defend what mattered most. And sometimes, when the desert wind was just right and the stars shone with particular brightness, travelers in that remote country would report seeing a woman with auburn hair and green eyes riding beside an Apache warrior, both of them moving through the landscape with the confidence of people who'd found their true home at last. Their story became legend among the Apache, told around countless fires to children who needed to understand that love could conquer fear, that courage could triumph over tyranny, and that sometimes the most unlikely people could find each other across the vast distances that seemed to separate different worlds. Because in the end, Rosalind Harper had discovered something that no amount of wealth or social position could ever provide, the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to love, living exactly the life she was born to live. And that knowledge, once gained, could never be taken away by any judge, any army, or any force on earth. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.